Hey everybody, welcome back again to another episode of the Armchair Experts Guide to Writing series. And this one is going to be a two-parter. The first one is going to be more of a basic overview and discussion. Like I said, more of the pros and cons approach to the particular topic. And then the second one will I'll be creating a little bit of a PowerPoint visual guide and including some extra external resources as well, dealing with the topic. And that is something that is actually, I find incredibly fun to do. And I know there's a lot of people out there in the world building land that it's almost like the very first thing, or maybe the only thing that they tackle as far as a project, and that is creating maps for your fantasy worlds that you're going to include with your story. And maps, like I said, they can be a lot of fun. They can add an additional element of creativity and enjoyment for your readers, because they have a visual representation of the world that you've created. They can kind of, if you're doing kind of more of a traditional like hero's journey or something, like what you see in the Lord of the Rings, and you've got kind of a little map, a little guide you can see where in the world, all the places that were visited by the protagonists, where the Dark Lord's, domain is, and where his, fortress is located, and, where all these different, parts of the world exist. But of course, like anything, there are drawbacks. So with the positives come the negatives, or, not necessarily negatives, but hurdles and challenges that need to be overcome that can stymie your creative process as far as the actual story goes. Because again, like with the world builder syndrome, the map creation part can become very time consuming, especially if you're really new at designing and are a bit of a perfectionist. Personally, I have one of several maps created. There are other ones I have yet to commission, but I did commission my fantasy world map, and I'll probably include it in the second video, and to use it as a bit of a guide and kind of explain my my thinking for how I had my map set designed, because I actually did commission somebody with a better understanding of the map making, making things more realistic, more accurate, better understanding of how mountain ranges are developed, and how the paths of rivers and how the coastlines and that sort of thing, to give it a a much more accurate, believable appearance, and actually follow with how geographical and geological features come to be in the world. And that's, like I said, that's more of that kind of information I'll include in the second video. And as well as you have locations of towns and villages and political boundaries and that sort of thing. But the problem is that when you include a map, the more detailed you go, obviously the more knowledge is required, and if you're going to do it yourself, and the more it can be held up to scrutiny, especially if you're trying to create a world that's supposed to be fairly realistic, like maybe an alternate medieval Europe or something, and in your the design of your map, if your kind of your selling point is is the realism, kind of like how A Song of Ice and Fire has been hyped up as being a real depiction of kind of a pseudo medieval period, when in reality it really isn't. But that's a topic for another video. I mean, I'll include a map of Westeros in the second video, and some criticisms that I've come across online about its layout and whatnot. So yeah, that's one thing to think about, is like the more in depth and the more detail you go, the more likely it's going to fall to scrutiny. Whereas if you have a real basic setup, something like Tolkien did with the map of Middle Earth, you get a general idea of where everything's located, but you don't have specific distances mapped out. which, if you have like I have actually on mine, I do have a legend, with the actual, distance, kind of scale and everything. So you can actually look at the map and know specifically the distances from one point to another. It's there in detail. And I purposely, picked that, kind of that size. And I'll talk about that more in the second video. But like I said, with Tolkien's map, you've got a general idea of where everything's at. You are given kind of an idea, at least, through the prose of distances traveled and, amount of time traveled. But, if you had like a map where, somebody had a distance, that was supposedly the span of that distance was traveled in, like, let's say a week. But in reality, if, given the size of the map, a week would have, could have been way too quickly, of a time to cross that distance, or way too, long a time to cross that distance. And then, then you run into problems, and it makes you look a little bit more amateurish when you make these kind of simple mistakes, or show that you don't really have a firm grasp on these concepts, especially when you're using certain types of travel, whether it's on foot or horseback, or, so on and so forth. So my advice would be don't think you have to have this insanely detailed map, where, everything, and everything that you could possibly put on a map is in there, unless you are knowledgeable about it, or you're willing, you're very knowledgeable about how to lay everything out, and, where, cities and fortresses and everything would be strategically located. Like I said, how rivers form, how they move through, the landscape, and and how they approach the sea, all that kind of knowledge, developing mountain ranges that look depicted as, actually how they should be, on the lands itself and whatnot. If you don't know that, and you're not willing to pay to have someone, do the map for you, and it can, the better, the map maker, the better the artist, the more expensive it's going to be. And mine wasn't cheap by any means, but it was valuable to me, even if and ultimately end up not including it with the story itself, as an addition or an accompaniment to the writing. But so yeah, just take that in mind. If you have a more vague, basic map with some, key points put on there, and assuming you want to include it with the book, if you're going to do a printed book or an ebook, include it with the book itself. That kind of lets you get a general idea for the audience of where things are, without having to commit to having the level of detail in the map that also needs to be, focused on more in the story as well. There's a lot of things to consider. You don't necessarily have to have a map. That's one thing. You don't need to have a map with your book. Like I said, even if we didn't have a map of Middle Earth, which is, one that Tolkien drew himself, it's not going to be a make or break. We're just going to have to use our imagination more, and maybe, as a fan, maybe some people would, create a map with the different locations based on what's described in the book. So people will tend to still get a pretty good idea of the world that you've created through descriptions, and descriptions of distances, and traveled between cities, or landscapes, and where mountain ranges are located, or lakes are located, or if there's any kind of major rivers that are sources of transportation, because river travel, for merchants and goods, depending on the technology used in that, the time that your story takes place, becomes very important. Like I said, it's something that may be something to do after the fact. But for me personally, the map that I had commissioned is used as a reference for writing, more than it is something to display as kind of something cool, visual that goes along with it for other people. Like I said, for me, first and foremost, it's a reference, and to keep in mind, the distances between, major cities, especially if I'm going to deal with, battles and, sieges of castles and things like that, and get an idea of, how long it would take an army to travel to one point to the other, within the context of the story. I want to, be as accurate as possible. If they're traveling over certain kinds of terrain, would it limit the amount of soldiers that were in the army or was traveling, and the amount of time it would take, and the locations, strategic locations of fortresses, and bridges, and anything like that could affect sieges and travel times, and like I said, and obstacles that armies would have to overcome, and like I said, strategic opportunities for certain armies. So it just kind of gives me a reminder to keep me kind of focused, and also can, I have all the different kingdoms and noble houses, or whatever, all that sort of stuff kind of plotted out all over, and it keeps accurate to wherever one is actually located. So I'm not kind of I'm not confusing locations because I don't have anything to go by. And like I said, I may end up ultimately changing some things, but yeah, and it's there for inspiration too. It's it's not a physical something I can hold unless I print it out. And one of these days I actually might get a full poster print of it. Especially if I'm certain that it's 100% how I want it to be, and put it up on the wall as something I can look at while I'm typing and writing, and get inspired by. Because, it's like, there's my fantasy world, there's all the names of the kingdoms, and, and I've got a lot of, creative ideas based off of, in reference to the map. So, it's like I said, it's almost like a creative, kind of spark, or kind of, reminder of, of certain events that I've, brainstormed and whatnot. So yeah, there's like I said, for maps, decide right at the beginning if you really need to even do a map at all. Don't feel compelled that you have to have a map. It's it's not going to, I doubt it's going to make a huge difference in whether or not your story does well, unless your story is about a cartographer or something, and or it's about maps are like the actual main focus of the story. Then obviously, yeah, a very detailed map is going to be important. But make, like I said, because it's time away from, you're going to devote to that world building part of it, and it's time you're going to take away from actually writing. So that is a compromise in itself there. So yeah, like I said, determine if it's even worth doing, and then if you decide that you have to do it, stick with what's most comfortable for you as far as your own skill set and your own knowledge of maps and cartography and geology and geography. So you don't come across as looking like you don't have any idea, because the beginner maps are usually really bad. Like I said, a lot of people don't understand how the the kind of the basic geological structures of the planet work, like plate tectonics, and glaciers, and how lakes and stream beds and whatnot are carved out, how rivers are formed, and the size of rivers depending on the rain seasons, and the snowpack and melts during the spring and all that. So it can be a bit tricky unless you're willing to do a lot of research. And like so with anything, to do research is a good idea before you really decide to tackle it. And if you got the money, there you go. I'll leave some links to cartography related stuff in the second video. Yeah, like I said, if you've got the money and you're committed to having a very professional looking map that's done well and looks accurate as far as how the landscape is laid out, and mountains, and how the rivers are formed, and how they traverse the map and everything, and that's something you want to invest in, then feel free. I'm completely satisfied with how mine showed up. or came out, I should say. And so yeah, that's pretty much it with the map thing. Like anything, you decide, like, weigh the positives and negatives. Is it going to be worth investing time in? And are you going to plan on actually, including it in the physical copy or the electronic copy of your book? Does the type of story you're telling and the level of detail in that story and the kind of things that are taking place, going to be easier to convey if you've got a map as a reference, which is that's pretty much a big thing for me, or not. If that's not really that important. Like I said, if you're just telling like a kid's story or children's kind of basic, or something like The Hobbit or something, which is just kind of an adventure, and you go over mountains and and caves and over rivers and things, you can give a pretty generic description and the time of travel. You could say they've been traveling for a week, or traveling for several days or something, and they cover this span of time and reach this certain point. That's usually pretty satisfactory in most stories, and gets the point across, and isn't really gonna, I don't think, disappoint or confuse your reader, obviously. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Like I said, don't feel compelled to include a map just because it's a fantasy world and you've got all these great ideas and of all these kind of exotic kingdoms and everything. Like I said, it needs to serve a purpose beyond just kind of being eye candy and something you want to spend your time messing with as a side project. Like I said, focus. Remember, you can't lose focus on the writing itself, because you can, like I said, you can get trapped into wanting to get overly obsessive with world building, and maps are one of the big world building visuals that you'll find, other than character concepts and creature concepts and that thing of kind of drawing out. So I'll come up with some visuals and some kind of mistakes and what not to do when it comes to designing the maps, and that are kind of a general consensus of those that are very knowledgeable about the craft in the next video, and go over my own map and give kind of an explanation of why I designed it the way I did, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that video will be enjoyable for you, and hopefully this will give you a little bit better idea of when coming up with whether or not you actually need to devote any time to coming up with a map for your world. So until the next video, everybody, take it easy.